Welcome to episode 5 of Dreamcatchers. I'm Lex Napa here with Amanda, founder of AMS Creative Studio and Voices of Anxiety, a website resource for people living with anxiety and other mental health conditions. So thanks so much for coming. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'd love to hear more about your projects kind of in your own words, so why don't we start there?
Yeah, definitely. So Voices of Anxiety has been around for a little over a year and a half now. I started it from my own personal experience living with multiple anxiety conditions. So the website has podcasts, blog posts, self-care courses, and just general resources for those living with anxiety, other mental health conditions, and also more importantly, on the same topic is resources for the family members and also the greater community. And then I also recently started my own little side business called AMS Creative Studio, and it is a marketing consulting business that I create content, manage social media, and other marketing tasks for my clients.
Wow, so you do a lot.
Yeah, and I have a day job too.
Yeah, that's amazing that you're able to fit so much into that just small amount of time.
Yeah, I like to be busy, but I definitely, along with, I preach self-care, so I definitely take the time to put aside some time for self-care.
Right, the balance has got to be really important.
Definitely.
Your blog, Voices of Anxiety, has a lot of great advice for highly sensitive people and people living with anxiety and other mental health conditions, like how to practice self-care in the midst of feeling overwhelmed and how to create more empowering work environments. And your recommendations are really spot on, and they feel like they come from a place of lived experience. So why don't you tell me more about kind of your relationship with your work and how it's kind of formed over time?
Yeah, definitely. So I started, obviously, Voices of Anxiety with the personal experience of anxiety. I went through a really severe bout of it later adolescence when I was leaving high school and moving into my college years, and I had some, family things going on at the time. I was also in the midst of the coming out process, so there's just kind of a lot going on, and I just didn't have the coping skills at that age, and no one really kind of talked about anxiety and depression or mental health conditions when I was growing up. So luckily I was able to get into therapy and go through the therapeutic process and really get a hold on my panic and anxiety that was going on during that time. And then as I was graduating college and connecting with more people, I majored in psych and women's studies, so there was a lot of community-based events going on. And I really came across a lot of people who had anxiety and depression, and no one was really talking about it. And then come to find out, a handful of my friends had anxiety, and here we all are struggling in silence and feeling shame about it. So I was really inspired to kind of create a place for people to come when they're really feeling low and when they're really struggling, or if they're just trying to maintain their mental health recovery or just looking for self-care tips. That's the thing, is that it's not just for people with anxiety and mental health conditions. I think a lot of people can learn, how to deepen their self-care practice, or even how to talk to their boss if they're feeling stressed and overwhelmed. So that's kind of a little bit more about my connection and why I started the website.
How did you identify community as the most important part? Because it sounds like community is super vital to your project.
I think as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and also someone who has been involved in a lot of social justice things over the years, I've recognized that we can't go alone at this stuff alone. We really need community, because I think a lot of us have experienced that the communities we grew up with are not necessarily equipped or able to have these discussions, whether it's the coming out process or mental health conditions or a wide range of things. So I really saw that developing and maintaining communities really does help people who are going through these challenging times.
Yeah, and helping them build up their own skill level to be able to cope as well.
Definitely.
I know a lot of people who suffer feel like they're suffering alone or they're suffering in silence. Mm-hmm. And, when the overwhelm of the world outweighs your ability to cope with it, that's when, real illness starts, and that's when real problems can surface. So arming people with those coping skills can in turn make the world feel a little bit less overwhelming. And it seems like your project is really centered around like giving people tools to try like in times of overwhelm, which is often so important.
Right. And yeah, and definitely giving those people a voice who have not had a voice in the past, to talk about the issues that they want to talk about. And I think, yeah, like there's strength in community, and there's strength in connecting people's stories.
Right. Yeah, and to kind of jump off that, connecting people's stories, your project's called Voices of Anxiety. Yeah. So it's not just your voice, it's the voice of many. So
right.
Tell me more about where that comes into your project.
So I actually, the website was actually like a second thought. The initial thought was actually just to kind of collect a bunch of stories and publish a book. And then I was thinking that definitely takes a lot of time, and I wanted it to be really inclusive. So actually, since I started the website, I've been collecting stories for this book for the past year and a half. And so the stories are of people from different communities who have experienced anxiety in one way or another. Some people will tell their life story in it, or they'll tell a moment in time about their experiences with anxiety. So I initially had thought of Voices of Anxiety because I wanted to give people who have anxiety and other mental health conditions a voice and be able to share their story so we can help connect, and possibly help the kid who's 15 in high school overwhelmed, kind of how I was when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. Because I was able to connect with other people's stories, and it really helped me not feel so isolated.
Right. So how did you find those stories then back in the day before, things like this really existed?
Yeah, great question. So when I first started therapy at 17, I think it's very common for a lot of therapists to recommend the anxiety and phobia workbook. It's kind of like their go-to for people who have phobias, OCD, and generalized anxiety. And so each chapter kind of goes into each condition, and it's very CBT based, so cognitive behavioral therapy. So essentially just recognizing the patterns that are kind of propelling the anxiety and trying to get a hold of it and expose yourself to it.
Right.
It's a little bit complicated to understand,
mm-hmm.
but or explain. So it was great doing those exercises, but the thing that really helped me was in the beginning of each chapter, I read a story from someone who had gone through a similar experience. So someone who was having multiple panic attacks every single day, or who was having intrusive thoughts, so a form of like OCD. And so being able to relate certain parts of their story to my story was really where that kind of like came to fruition, and where I kind of first got the idea, and then where I was able to kind of pull myself out of that isolation at the beginning. Yeah, no, I can definitely relate to that. Just, studying psychology, mm-hmm. reading all of these textbooks, and especially CBT textbooks, they could get kind of dense. Yeah.
And a lot of times the vignettes were really what spoke to me the most. The stories of real people suffering and how mm-hmm. they're managing to get through it. That was a hugely poignant part of the textbooks that I feel like just kind of get peppered in for color, but,
right.
Are really, really important and can mean so much to people who are struggling to see and hear that they're not alone with it.
Exactly, yeah. And, throughout history, we've connected cultures and traditions through storytelling, and I think that's kind of where the root of it is,
mm-hmm.
the power of storytelling.
How were you able to turn your own personal experience of anxiety into something bigger, into something meaningful and purposeful for others?
As someone who's always been very social justice driven, and who's been involved in the mental health community even when I was going through my own struggles, I knew that when I kind of got a handle on my anxiety, I really wanted to start talking about it, because the only way that we can destigmatize mental health, or one of the ways, is to really talk about it and to really open up. Millions of Americans on a daily basis are struggling with anxiety and depression, and then, you know, countless other people with bipolar, schizophrenia. I really find the importance of talking about it, sharing my story. A few years ago, I was able to really think about what I wanted out of this project, and I saw a need for it. You know, we see a lot of commercials for depression, and I think culturally we're having more of a conversation about depression. It's definitely not where it needs to be.
Right.
But I think a lot of times people tend to see anxiety as this like fleeting thing that it happens like once or twice and then you're like over it. But in actuality, it's really debilitating, and a lot of people end up becoming agoraphobic, so they essentially won't leave their house because their mind is telling them that the outside world is so unsafe for them. So I just really wanted to kind of have this place where I could talk about my experiences, where I could share other people's experiences, and really turn something that was very negative and very dark for me at one point in my life into kind of a more positive thing, that even if you go through this experience, you will come out on the other side, and like this thing is, it does get better, you know, but that's the thing too, is that I do talk a lot about mental health recovery, and it's a lifelong journey. And I've certainly had my ups and downs, and I talk about how life transitions and changes definitely impact my anxiety. So learning those triggers and really deepening a self-care practice can definitely help in the mental health recovery.
Yeah. It sounds like you've really made this transition from, you know, the darkness of being alone with it into the light, and surrounding yourself in community and like-minded people who, you know, not only understand but are willing to have that conversation, which is so huge in a society that's still bound by stigma.
Right.
And stigma is still a huge issue. So what do you think your role is as someone, you know, as a voice of anxiety in helping eradicate stigma?
I think firsthand just sharing my story and just being that type of person who all my friends and people who know me on Facebook, I'm very open about having anxiety. I'm very open about having actually 3 anxiety conditions. So it's panic, generalized, and OCD. And the fact that I think because they can see me live successfully and to be able to continue doing work within the community, they're able to understand that mental health isn't always what we picture it to be, you know? Right. I think a lot of the times we tend to kind of really see it as people who are, you know, incapable of doing anything, and who just kind of like lay on the couch and, you know, just kind of like really not positive views of it. Yeah. So being able, again, to kind of just talk about it and just being like a positive voice and a positive image for it, is definitely one place where we can kind of start that destigmatization. And then other organizations like NAMI and other mental health organizations, they do peer-to-peer programs. They go into businesses and talk about mental health conditions, like CEOs Against Stigma. Yeah. There's a lot of like really great campaigns like Active Minds on college campuses. They really talk a lot about the suicide rates of college students, which is, I think it's the highest demographic at that age group, like college students, and also I think vets too. I don't know the exact statistics, but yeah, the rates are really high for college students. So there are a lot of these organizations that are doing amazing work. But I also think it's important to have people who have lived experiences come out and talk about it, because it's one thing. It's great that we have psychologists and psychiatrists coming out and, you know, talking about that stuff, but I think it's equally important to have people who have the lived experience and who kind of got out on the other side, you know, but also understand that it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, you know, back in the days when institutionalization was a thing and people were kind of brought to the hospital on the hill in the woods away and isolated from, you know, daily life, I think people don't necessarily expect that physical separation anymore, but they definitely still expect that separation where if you're suffering, you should be somewhere else. You should be seeking help with a psychologist. You should be going inpatient. You should be doing all of these things all of these things except what really helps, which is being part of the community and kind of weaving back into the fabric and finding a place of belonging.
Right.
So fighting stigma, I think, is also about kind of taking away that barrier between, institutions and community.
Right.
So it sounds like your work with Voices of Anxiety is really working to do that, to bring together all of these different identities, different experiences into one to kind of fight against that.
Yeah, and it's like it's giving the power to the individual and not to the care manager or the psychologist or the psychiatrist, which are vital for a lot of people in mental health recovery, but they're not always there for you, and I think that, again, the power and the connection of the people within your community are lifelong and life lasting. It's the people I've connected with in NAMI and the work that I've done with them. I still continue my work with them, and they've had some involvement with the work that I do and the work that they do. So it's just, I think that way it gives them the empowerment and, okay, I'm in charge of my own recovery, and this is some people choose that they don't want to be on medication or they want more alternative practices. So
right.
I think, again, just giving the power back to the individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot about empowerment and connection. So.
Yes. Yeah.
And do you think it's any different for people in the queer community who kind of have that, additional intersecting identity of being, LGBTQ, and how that might affect their process of belonging and community and, eradicating stigma?
Yeah, definitely. I think both communities have barriers. Again, it's demographics, it's parts of the country. I've done work with Fenway Health. I was a helpline counselor, and, I talked to a lot of people in the South. In the Bible Belt, my partner is from the South, and they've experienced violence because of their identity. Mm-hmm. So I think that each community has their barriers that they face, and I think that obviously mental health within the LGBT community is not as talked about as much as it should be. Mm-hmm. We do talk about it, and there are organizations, but I think broadly, for a long time we were talking about marriage and don't ask, don't tell, and, all these things are great, and it definitely helps progress communities forward and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I think the intersection of other identities like race and class and mental health conditions, I mean, let's face it, a lot of those people aren't really concerned about getting married, that's not their first, or that's not their first thought, their first thought is, helping themselves and getting better. And, if they're struggling with a mental health condition, or, if they're trying to get a job, there's just a lot of barriers that individuals with mental health conditions in the LGBT community face. I feel like that topic in itself is one that's very heavy, and there's a lot to unpack there. Right. And that's why I definitely want to kind of shift gears in some sense, and do want to focus a lot of like future content on communities that are facing discrimination just because of who they are, and then the further discrimination of getting mental health services. Going back to the South, if you look queer and then, trying to find a psychologist, it's just, we're blessed kind of in Boston because we have everything around us, and, we have very queer friendly organizations, and you can walk into Fenway and you're like, okay, like they get pronouns, they get all these things. And other parts of the country, it's not there. It's definitely something that needs to be further explored. Obviously, being a part of both communities, I feel a little bit of a responsibility to kind of do more work there.
And I think that also having the queer identity can get political, and especially in these times that are hugely politically charged, and there's so much kind of threatened to be taken away from the community, that there's an urge to feel the need to stand up and fight for that, and to be the most fully formed, eloquent, articulate, put together human being to get your point across to the powers that be politically, which I think erases some of the mental health component that goes into just being part of the LGBTQ community. The rates of, mental illness are higher.
Right.
And having to hide that, I feel like, is just another layer of stigma that, queer people in the community are facing.
Yeah, it's continually pushing it down. And, we also look at, a lot of us get this already, but it's like, who's representing us? It's been the same people who have been representing us for years. And, I think that they want to talk about a lot of the issues that are center focused to them, which is great. Any issue we got to talk about. But like I said, it's just, if you're struggling even to get out of the house or to get a job because your queer identity, I think that sometimes the last thing on your mind is your future and getting married and, a lot of those things. So,
right.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm glad we were able to kind of veer that way. I feel like that's a conversation that could last an entire podcast.
Totally. So. Yeah, it's very political.
Definitely. So bringing it back in, reining myself back in, wondering if you have anybody in your life who's inspired you.
Yeah, I would say my mom is definitely the person who's inspired me. She's just so compassionate, and she was the person who was there for me when I was going through my really tough times in life, and being able to see her strength over the years, and the things that she's dealt with on, personal and professional level, going back to nursing school when she was 35 and, have 2 young kids and work full time.
Wow.
I definitely got, her worth ethic and, the ability to, manage a lot of different things. So she inspired me that, you can do what you want to do in life. So
yeah. And it sounds like there's no age too late to keep growing too.
Yeah, definitely. And and she's in her early 50s now, and her career has continued to grow, and she's a resident care director of a retirement community now. So she has a really great job and a lot of responsibilities. And, she loves nursing, but she knew that she had more potential within nursing and even business and, just further helping people. And I think too, she inspired me to help others because she's always kind of been in the helping profession, as a nurse or CNA.
Right.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have to people who are listening right now? Maybe they're suffering with a mental health condition. What advice could you give them if they're looking to follow their dreams and pursue a passion?
Definitely. I would say, well, first off, a lot of people who are creatives and who are passionate people do experience mental health conditions. Some of the greatest minds had, a lot of mental health conditions. So I would say you're not alone. I would say that your priority is definitely your mental health recovery. And then I think during the process, being able to put your feelings and whatever out onto paper or painting or whatever your creative passion is, do it. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time. It doesn't have to be perfect the second or the 5th time. I think just getting out there and putting out your work or whatever avenue you want to do it is really important because, you have a unique perspective and you should share it with the world.
Right. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on the show and talking with me. I feel like it's been such a good conversation that my mind's going a million miles a minute trying to figure out which questions to ask. But basically, I'm wondering if, there are any updates that the listeners should be aware of in projects that you've got going on right now that might be good to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. So early in the podcast, we spoke about the Voices of Anxiety book that I'm hoping to publish, I believe, later this year. It will be self-published. And I am actually still taking stories up until, I believe, April 15th. Yes. So if anyone is interested in sharing their experience living with anxiety, I would love to have you be a part of the book. It can be a page long, it can be 10 pages long. So that's one project that is in the works at the moment. And then I am also going to focus on releasing a general self-care course in the spring. And then also in June, I'm going to release an LGBTQ self-care course for the community.
Okay, so we have a lot to look forward to.
Yeah.
Where might someone be able to contribute to the book?
You could go to my website, voicesofanxiety.com. There's a section where you can share your story. You can just type in your email address, or if you just wanted to send it directly to me, it's amanda@voicesofanxiety.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for being here. And you heard it. To learn more, go to voicesofanxiety.com.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And don't forget, if you'd like to support the podcast and hear more episodes like this, please go to my Indiegogo campaign, which you can find on dreamcatcherspodcast.com. This has been an episode of Dreamcatchers. Thanks for listening, and remember to always keep dreaming.